This is a lecture that is designed to give some background on where we get URLs from, what the definition of a URL is. At a high level, the things that we want to cover is the idea that what we call a web link can more precisely be described as a URL. URL is an acronym for Uniform Resource Locator. URLs are a convention that we use for locating files globally on the internet through the network of computers. A URL has several components that we need to discuss, and although URLs conceptually seem to be referring to files, they may not actually be referring to files that exist on a hard drive somewhere. So what's the motivation? Originally we wanted to be able to share different things that maybe were on individual computers. And so a friend might say, hey, can you send me a link to that hilarious cat video? And you have the cat video maybe playing in your browser, and you grab that link from the top of your browser, you copy it, you paste it into an email or a text message or whatever you've got, and you send it off. And by sending off that link, you're able to pass on a resource on the internet, in this case a GIF file, and you're able to send that to someone else, and then they, using that link that you passed them, are able to find the same resource using the internet as well. So this is the motivation for a URL, being able to identify the same thing using a name, using a path, using a locator that works regardless of where you start from on the internet. So this is a link to that GIF that I just showed you. Just grabbed it off the internet from a search on a search engine. You can see there are a lot of pieces from it. You see a lot of slashes, some numbers, you see dots and some names in there as well. You see .com, that seems familiar. Let's break this down and look at what all the individual pieces are more generally. Starting with the idea that when we talk about a web link or a link, what we're more formally going to call it is a URL. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. In computer science, in the domain of computer science, there's a little bit of a discussion about what the difference is between a URL and a URI. Sometimes you'll see the word web link and URL used interchangeably, and sometimes you'll hear the acronym URL and URI used interchangeably. URI stands for a Uniform Resource Identifier. It's slightly more general in that it can refer to things that aren't actually maybe files, although URLs aren't really used just to identify files anymore. So just know that there are different terms for it, and URI is generally considered more general than a URL. And a URL is more formal or more precise than saying a web link. So the context, back in the day, before there was a standardized internet that anyone could connect to, computers on their hard drive would have a path name that you would use in order to access a file. This still exists in the computers that we use today on the different platforms. So a Windows computer, for example, uses a path name like C:/users djp desktop info.doc. And so if you look in maybe the File Explorer, or you look in different places in Windows, you'll see a file path that looks something like that. A Macintoshes as we know them today didn't exist before the internet, but a Macintosh file path looks like similar. It's users djp3 for me, desktop, and info.doc. So both of these referring to a .doc file. You can see the Mac address, the Mac file path, doesn't include any information about the hard drive, the C:, that Windows does. And you can see that it uses a different kind of slash in order to separate the different directories in the file hierarchy. Finally, Linux looks a little bit more like Mac. They're based on similar underlying technology in the operating system. But instead of starting with a users directory, the top directory in most Linux systems that contain the users file is called home. So /home/djp3/desktop/info.doc. Those are three different file paths existing on three different operating systems that are referencing maybe the same file, but they're existing on different hard drives. So when it came time to connect all these computers, it became necessary to be able to identify that file as it existed on these three different machines using one standard way of specifying the paths, not differentiating or not having to confuse the different kinds of slashes or the hard drive recommendation. Format on each of the operating systems that described this file path was different. And when the computers were finally connected, the standard access of finding files across the network was needed. URLs, as a result, make the internet look like it's one big file system, one enormous hard drive, so that we can access files, a cat GIF, or a Word doc, anywhere on the internet by using the same path identifier. So what it looked like before the computers were connected were all these files on different machines, and a user had to keep track of which machine they were on and didn't really have any way of getting them together. As the computers became connected, it became a little bit easier to be able to find the computers, and then as URLs were standardized, the computer that they were on became less important, and the position where those files existed within the network became the dominant way of thinking about the file. So there are a lot of details in how we specify a uniform resource locator. Let's look at a few of them. Let's take, for example, a book by Paul Durisch that is about to be published, at least at the time at which this is being filmed, The Stuff of Bits. If we go onto the internet and we would like to find the page on Amazon.com that describes this book, so not just the document, the web page that describes it, we have to find a bunch of different components and put them together into a URL. The first one that we need to identify is called the host. And the host is the name of a computer or a group of computers that holds the resource which you are referencing or which you would like to obtain. So in this case, the host is Amazon.com. Now, in today's day and age, we often just associate the host itself with the company. The company and the host are sometimes interchangeable or indistinguishable. Formally, though, in a URL, this host name refers to the organization or the group of computers on the internet that holds the file that you're looking for. The next piece is the subdomain. So on the front of Amazon.com, in some web addresses, we prepend www, which stands for World Wide Web, as a subdomain. But we can prepend different subdomains to the beginning of that host name as well to form a valid URL. This subdomain is just a subgroup of computers within the host's organization. And the host has the freedom to pick a name as they wish, as long as they configure their servers to respond to that name. So www.amazon.com. Following that host name with the subdomain, we use a slash in the style of Unix or Macintosh systems, and we call this the path. And conceptually, this is a file path that hierarchically arranges all the documents that are available on that host into a hierarchical tree, into a system of resources that we can get separated by the slash. So for example, in this hierarchy, we have three different levels. The first level appears to be a directory called stuff-bits-sa-materialities-information. That appears to be followed by a subdirectory called dp, followed by another subdirectory with a number 02620362207, and then finally we have the resource itself that we're interested in obtaining. And this ref equals with that code name there apparently is a file that we are accessing that has all the information about this book that we might be interested in. Now at the very beginning of this, we put https://. That's called the scheme. The scheme is a description of how the internet needs to be traversed in order to get that document. There are many common ones that are used. For example, http:// and https://. Those are very common ways of identifying resources on the internet. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. And then the last one that we see more often than not is file. And that means that rather than going out on the internet in order to find the resource, we're going to look on our local hard drive in order to find a resource. For example, if you're on a browser. There are many other schemes that you might possibly run across, but they're much rarer. Things like SSH or FTP, mail-to, or IRC:. All different ways of traversing the internet in order to get some kind of a resource that's out there. All right, the next part that you might have is on the very end of your resource, you might have something that starts with a question mark. And the question mark indicates that whatever follows it is a query in the style of a search engine. In a search engine, you enter a query in order to get information back. So in this case, what we're doing is we're specifying this file location, and we're adding a query to the end of it, saying we want some subset of that file. We want some arrangement of that file that the server is going to provide for us. So we're just requesting a part of the resource, and we're going to identify how we want it to be set up with the question mark. What follows the question mark are the query parameters and the query itself. So we often find different components of our query specified with equal signs, where the left side of the query will be a parameter name and the right side will be a parameter value. So in this case, we're passing a query to Amazon.com about this resource where we're saying we want S equal to books. I don't know for sure what that means. It probably means that we're looking for the versions of stuff of bits that are formatted in book format. Hardcover, paperback, maybe Kindle. There are some other ones. In fact, you can have as many as you'd like, and they get separated by an ampersand. So in this example here, we have 3 different parameters. The first one's called S. The second one is IE. The third is QID. Oh, I'm sorry, there are 4. And the fourth one is SR. Each of them have a value that is being passed to the query. Each one of those parameters is separated by the ampersand. Well, there's a little bit more that you can add as well. So just like in the old days of telephone communication, when you had to have a human operator that would manually patch hard connections from one location to another by connecting those 2 different ports with a wire, you can also specify which port in a computer that you want to connect to on the far side. So on your computer in the browser, you can specify that I would like to connect to port number 80 on the remote computer. Now these ports are no longer physical ports. They're not separate wires that are going into the computer. But you can imagine conceptually that they do work like different wires going into a computer. You can have any of a number between 0 and 65,536. So it's as if you have 65,000 different wires going into the computer. The way this works is that certain numbers are assigned to different protocols by convention. So for example, if you add a :80 at the end of your host name, you're saying, I specifically want to connect to port 80 on the remote machine. Now you don't often see that in web requests because by default an HTTP protocol request is on port 80. And an HTTPS port by default uses 443. So if you don't specify which port you want, then you're going to get the default that's associated with it. In this example, we've mixed up the defaults. We've used HTTPS, but we're asking for port 80. Usually this won't work. Finally, in some protocols, you can add a username and password to the beginning of your URL. This would be for some kind of a resource that's located on the internet that you would like access to, but you need to supply credentials or authentication in order to get access to those resources. So if you had a protocol that used this, you'd pass a username, a colon, and a password, and then the @ symbol, followed by all the different details that we've talked about so far. This is the origin of where our email addresses came from, specifying a username and a domain at which resources were located. Finally, the last piece of a URL is at the end of all of this, we can put a hashtag symbol followed by what we call a fragment. And the fragment says we would like, after we've requested a resource, passed query parameters, what we get back, we would like to focus in on a section of the document or a section of the resource that comes back that goes by the name of product details in this example here. In general, it can be any number name, any name that's referenced in the document. So this is a particular piece of the resource that you're interested in, and we're going to preface it with a hashtag. All right, so if we take all of those pieces, I'm going to remove the username and password and the default port name because it's not necessary in this case. We put all those pieces together, and then we attempt to get a resource on the internet. We're going to get the web page from Amazon.com that describes this book, and it's going to immediately jump down to the product details because in this case, the Amazon web page has a section that's called product details that you can reference immediately within the URL. Many different parts of a URL then come together in order to find this specific resource on the internet. Our general form then consists of a pattern that looks like this. A scheme at the beginning of our URL, followed by a colon and maybe 2 backslashes, depending on which scheme it is, a username, a colon, and a password, an @ symbol, the host name, possibly with a subdomain, so that would be where www.amazon.com would go, a colon and a port if we need to specify which one of the connections on the remote computer we're going to connect to, a path, which is the directory location of the resource we want, followed possibly by a question mark, a query, an ampersand, and a bunch of different keys and values. And then at the end, we may also have a fragment. So these are all the cases of a very general form of a URL. Often you'll find URLs are simpler or don't have every one of these pieces because they're not necessary for the particular resource that you're interested in. Now this is the concept, a single unified file system that exists across the internet. In reality, however, the resource that you're requesting may not actually be a file that exists on a hard drive somewhere. It might actually be constructed on the fly. As you ask for a resource, the remote computer may be building that resource using software and delivering it to you as if a web page existed like that. For example, imagine you were checking the status of a train or an airplane. You might have a URL that references the flight number or the train number that you're interested in. When you request that resource from the remote computer, there's not a file that exists that tells you the status. Instead, there's a database that's being kept up to date with information from sensors on the track and possibly from input on the train itself that's feeding into a database. When you request that resource, the train table, the estimated time when the flight's going to arrive, the resource is constructed for you from components of the database and presented to you in the browser as if it was just a file located remotely on some train company or airline company's web hard drive. So the path might also, another tricky thing about the difference between the concept and the reality is that sometimes the path is actually part of the query. So just like we see examples of resources that are constructed on the fly, sometimes that hierarchy that seems to be present within the path doesn't actually reflect the hierarchy on a remote hard drive, even though you can kind of think of it as if it does. Instead, it might actually be specifying parts of the query in a different way, in a different style. And it might also be part of the parameters as well. You'll see that in some different conventions of web servers and web server frameworks that exist. One last thing about the difference between the concept and the reality. When you go to Amazon.com, that's not just one computer that's answering your request. It's actually a whole fleet of computers that are working together, acting as if they're one computer from your perspective as a user using a web browser. Those computers are all acting together to construct a web page on the fly, given the parameters that you've passed it in the URL, and delivering it back to you as if it was a single file on a document delivered by a single computer. All part of the magic of making the internet seem very simple to the user. So in summary, web links, we talk about them colloquially, are more precisely described as URLs, or Uniform Resource Locators. URLs are a convention for locating files globally across the internet, and they have several components that we've looked at. URLs don't always necessarily refer to actual files. Thanks for your attention. I hope after listening to this lecture, when you look at a web link, you'll see it with new eyes. You'll appreciate the complexity behind it and understand the different components that are there and why they're there. Thank you.